Hello, and welcome to our series, Using Your Math Curriculum Virtually. I'm Melinda Griffin, a researcher at the American Institutes for Research and a member of the Rhode Island Intensive Math Intervention Project. We've created a series of short modules to help you think through how to teach math virtually. In the previous model, we learned about teaching virtually in terms of how to teach. What do students and parents and teachers need to be successful in a virtual environment? In this second module, we'll discuss how to determine what you will teach, knowing that there will be adjustments to your usual pacing due to the limited time available. And in future modules, we'll think about how your online time with students might look and how your students will do math work independently. As discussed in the previous module, we have some guiding principles we'll adhere to for this series. Try to use what you've already been using in the classroom. Keep your teaching direct, clear, and simple. Combine new learning with keeping skills sharp, and make sure that whatever plans you have work for all families, whether they have online access or not. So let's get started. In this module, what are you going to teach? We're going to learn about choosing what is important in terms of the math standards, reworking your pacing guide, and thinking about supports for students. So let's start with choosing what's important in terms of the math standards that you'll be teaching. This is a very different environment from your regular classroom, so you're only going to expect to teach between 1/3 to 1/2 of what would normally happen in a lesson. Your textbook series may have the standards mapped out, but they tend to be focused on making sure that you teach all of the grade level standards over the course of a full academic year. We obviously have a much shorter time with our students now that we're working virtually, so we want to concentrate on what are the focus standards for your grade level, what skills have you already taught this year that need reinforcing, and for the next grade, what content happens at the beginning of the school year. You can do this work on your own, but I would highly suggest if you're part of a grade level team that you divide and conquer. That way this work is spread across all members. It gives you a chance to come together and talk it through, and it'll make it go much, much faster. If you're not already familiar with it, Achieve the Core has a great resource which shows you major math content and how it builds across grade levels from K through 8. This is a good way to look and see to get an idea of the main clusters that your students will focus on in your grade level, as far as what's coming next in the grade they'll go to next year. Another great resource that you'll find at Achieve the Core is for each grade level, you'll find a document showing the major supporting and additional clusters for that particular grade level. When you go in there, you'll also find a chart giving the highlights of major work in grades K through 8. This is kind of a condensed version of the larger chart that we looked on the previous slide. So when I look at this grade level, and we're going to use 5th grade as an example here, I see something called major clusters. So major clusters require greater emphasis than others based on the depth of the ideas, the time they take to master, and their importance to future mathematics. These standards may also require a stronger connection to the standards for mathematical practice. So looking in 5th grade, I have 5 major clusters. I have understand the place value system, form operations with multi-digit whole numbers and with decimals to the hundredths place, use equivalent fractions as a strategy to add and subtract fractions, apply and extend previous understandings of multiplication and division to multiply and divide fractions. And I also have a cluster around geometric measurement, particularly as it relates to volume. You also see that I have some supporting clusters listed here. So for 5th grade, there are 2 measurement groups under supporting clusters around converting measurement units within a given system and representing and interpreting data. It should be noted as well that 5th grade is the culminating grade level for measurement as a mathematical domain. When students move on to middle school the next year, they'll still use measurement, but it's going to be in terms of problem solving as opposed to something that they study directly. I also have additional clusters. So for 5th grade, I see operations and algebraic thinking and geometry as additional clusters. That means I don't teach these, but it means when I teach them, I don't have to give them quite as much emphasis because they're going to be used even more in the grade level that comes. I also should note for 5th grade, I have a required fluency. So by the end of 5th grade, students are expected to have mastered multi-digit multiplication. So now I'm going to go through an inventory of what I've taught so far this year for standards, particularly those in the major cluster, and I want to see what's still left to teach. Your math textbook may have a chart in the teacher manual that lays out the standards by unit, So you can compare that to your district pacing guide and see which standards are left. You can also use this to record other standards, keeping them in mind of what you've already taught and what has not yet been taught. So it's time now for some good news. Spring is traditionally state testing season in most places. So textbook publishers have front-loaded the major clusters in their unit order to make sure that students learn the material that will appear on that state assessment. This means you may have already taught most of the standards in the major clusters. So looking at our 5th grade example, if I look through my major clusters, I've already taught most of them except for this one cluster here around multiplication and division of fractions. I want to also look back and think about other standards in this grade level that relate to fractions, knowing that I might need to do some refreshing on those before I move into learning the new material. If I come over and look at other standards outside the major cluster, I only have one that I've taught here around measurement. But when I look at the standards that are left, they group nicely into 3 different areas by domain. So I need to go back and teach a unit on operations and algebraic thinking. I have other standards that group together in geometry, so that will also make a nice unit of study. And then I have this other standard here around measurement. Now it's kind of there by itself, but this standard in particular actually is about creating line plots in fractional increments. Students have already learned how to create line plots in earlier grades, so I can relate this back to my fraction standards here and possibly have students do more of this work independently or work it in over time just as a problem here and there. All right, so now let's put all this together. So far we've considered what you've already taught, what you still need to teach, and how you might organize the remaining standards. We still need to think about how you're going to pace your instruction in a virtual environment, and we also need to think about planning supports for students with disability, our multilanguage learners, and possibly our students who just struggle with mathematics in general. So to do this, it's going to be helpful to have a weekly planning template as well as a daily lesson planning template. This is for your own benefit and use. It's going to help you look at the flow of your lessons, think about the components of the lesson that you need, any assessments that might need to be in there as well, and also what are your students going to be doing for independent learning. This is also going to help you create your parent communication and your student communication, particularly around the weekly schedule that students will be following them, the learning goals and outcomes that you want for them daily, and also assignments and due dates that everybody needs to keep track of at home. So let's start by thinking about a weekly plan. So your textbook probably has a week at a glance type format where they would tell you what you would be teaching from Monday through Friday. For example, introducing a concept on Monday, perhaps with some new material, continuing new material on Tuesday, Wednesday, perhaps some groups problem solving on Thursday, and a review or quiz on Friday. During this, you'd have assessment going on as well. So things are going to be different in a virtual world. I would suggest you get rid of the Monday through Friday mindset and start thinking of it in terms of day 1, day 2, day 3, etc. Also remember that your students are only going to be able to cover about half of the content you normally would teach in a week. So you want to make sure that you account for that day-wise as well. Also, this is a new environment and your students may not have been doing any formal learning for the past few weeks. So it's not going to hurt anybody to have a day at the very beginning just on lead-in standards and a quick review. How do we operate in this new environment? So if I look at this now, I see I have assessment as well. Now, your school district may or may not be requiring students to do work for a grade, but regardless, as a teacher, you need to know if your students are learning or not. So in a formal world, we would have homework and observation going on in the classroom. We'd also maybe have an exit ticket here and there. We have a quiz and things like that. That's going to be much more difficult to do in a virtual environment. So I would suggest things like exit tickets that are short and sweet. I'm not going to do one every day, but I'm going to have a few in there to help gauge my students' understanding. And when I combine that with what I'm going to see with them in our online group work, then I should have a pretty good idea of where they're succeeding and where they might be struggling. So let's work through an example together. Let's go back and think about that 5th grade standard that I still need to teach as part of my major cluster. So the first thing I want to do is go through and thoroughly read the standard in its entirety. So in this case, I see that there's 3 parts. If I look through here, I see things like visual fraction models mentioned. I see some things about using the relationship between multiplication and division, so I want to make sure that I focus on that. I see a lot on solving real world problems, so I want to make sure that all of those come into play when I plan my instruction. I also want to look back and think about prior learning that happened. So students in grade 4 have already been doing division with whole numbers to solve problems. That ties in directly to what I'm going to do now, except I'm bringing in fractions. And in the future, I see that 6th graders are going to continue this work. So in 5th grade, I'm only going to do whole numbers by fractions and fractions by whole numbers. In 6th grade, they actually move on to dividing fractions by fractions. If I think about the other grade levels, modeling is a big component across all of these standards. So I want to make sure that I focus on that standard for mathematical practice around modeling. I should also note that while this is the culminating standard in the fractions domain, which ends in 5th grade, it's going to be continued on in 6th grade. In 6th grade, it becomes part of the ratios and proportions domain. Once again, I'm going to notice that in 5th grade, my focus is really on modeling. And since this concept continues in 6th grade, mastery won't be expected until students get to the end of that grade level. So if I take a look back at the original pacing for this standards, it states that I would use 7 days of instruction in my regular classroom. I also want to think when I look at this about how much time I need for each component of the standard. And then I'm going to pace out the lessons knowing that I'm going to need more time in the virtual world. So this takes me from 7 60-minute lessons to 12 20-minute lessons. And this planning guide is going to become my basis for writing my learner outcomes for my students. So let's look at our original pacing and how this maps to our virtual pacing guide. So in my original pacing, I had 1 day for division of fractions as an introductory lesson. I'm going to map that to 2 days in my virtual pacing guide, knowing that my students are going to need a review of multiplying fractions as a lead-in skill before we go into dividing. I'm going to keep the same pace for dividing unit fractions by whole numbers, knowing I can provide some additional practice for students to do on their own if I need to in those areas. But when I get to the problem-solving day, I'm going to take that 1 day from my original pacing guide and map it to 2 days in my virtual world. This is going to give me more time to do support one-on-one with my students if I need to, because problem solving can often be a leap for kids. I'm going to continue the same pace when I move to dividing whole numbers by unit fractions. And as I did above, I'm going to map that problem solving to 2 days. You'll notice at the bottom of the virtual pacing guide, I've added in 2 days that I'm calling mixed practice. Now, mixed practice is kind of a general term that I'm using. This gives me a bit of a time buffer. Remember, I want to support my students in their learning, particularly my English language learners, my kids who might be struggling with mathematics, and my special education students. So this is going to give me some more time to work with those students directly if I need to. It also gives me some time for my students to do mixed practice across the board with application problems, which are a heavy emphasis in this standard. If you're not already doing so, you want to make sure that you're working with your special education and your ESL teacher for ideas on how to support your students throughout this. And we're also going to talk a lot more about student supports in the next 2 modules coming up in this series. So we want to consider the various needs of our students in the classroom, and a great way to think about this is Universal Design for Learning. CAST, which is the Center for Applied Special Technology, has some really good resources for lesson planning, as well as developing learning goals and assessments. A lot of us are already suffering from executive functioning lapses these days, just due to the stress around us. And you probably have students in your classroom that you provide supports in a physical classroom with, but they're not there anymore and don't always translate to a virtual environment. So start thinking about support you can give these students for when they're doing their independent learning, such as checklists and other ways to self-monitor that are going to help them be successful now that they have a more independent approach. So it's also important to consider the needs of our students with disabilities and our multilingual and English language learners. Ideally, you'll continue to co-plan with your special education and ESL teachers, just as you would if you were at school. The Regional Educational Laboratory, which is part of the Institute for Education Sciences, has put out 2 excellent guides on supports for these students. And if you look at the guides, you'll also find links to further information that can be helpful. Our own project, the Rhode Island Intensive Math Project, has put together resources as well, which you can find in our Google Drive. You'll see the address for that on our last slide. This will give you supports that you can use to support these students, particularly in a virtual environment. So in this module, we looked back at your original pacing guides to map which standards you've already taught and consider standards which still need to be taught for the year, paying attention to the major standards for your grade level. We also talked about translating your original pacing guides to new virtual ones, remembering that your pace in a virtual environment is going to be much slower than it would be in your regular classroom. And we began thinking about student support you're going to need in a virtual environment. Remember across all of this that we want to make sure we share weekly and daily plans with students and their parents or guardians so they can plan independent learning at home. Most of all, I want you to remember that you've got this. All of these other things are going to come into play, but you still are the most important learning resource that your students have. So on behalf of the Rhode Island Math team, I'd like to thank you for tuning into this module, and I hope you'll visit the other ones in the series as well. We also have some great resources on our website, so be sure to check it out. And thank you so much for your time. Have a great day, and we'll see you again soon.